Little girl says to the Mafia boss. I think you're my daddy. He looks at single mom and goes pale. There is a certain stillness that settles over October nights. The kind of quiet that lulls you into believing that nothing bad could possibly happen. That night, I believed it too. Until a man in a black SUV shattered the illusion, carrying a bleeding dog in his arms and uttering a word that didn't belong in my world. Stray bullet. The smell of antiseptic still clung faintly to my lab coat as I fumbled for my keys after a long shift. The little veterinary clinic, tucked at the edge of Asheville, had just closed minutes ago. My daughter, Sophie, 11 years old, sat quietly on the bench beneath the dim porch light, hunched over her homework. She had spent more evenings like this than any child ever should, not because she wanted to, but because I couldn't afford a babysitter. I was a single mother, a veterinarian, and exhausted, bone-deep exhausted. As I sorted through the day's files, I called out to her, more out of habit than anything else. Almost done, sweetheart. I thought it would be just another ordinary night, but it wasn't. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights split the darkness. A tall man stepped out of the SUV, his face drawn tight, carrying something bundled in a blood-soaked blanket. My dog, he said, his voice strained, caught by a stray bullet. That word stray bullet hit me like a fist to the chest. It didn't belong here, not in this peaceful little clinic nestled among pine trees, and certainly not in Sophie's world. But the soft whimper from inside the blanket made it impossible to turn away. Bring it in, I said quickly, my voice hardening with instinct. And just like that, the night I thought would slip by quietly changed completely. In the small emergency room, Linda, my assistant and closest friend, and I scrambled to prepare for surgery. Sophie had been sent to the back room to rest, but I knew she was still watching silently from the crack in the door. Linda took the dog from the man's arms. A German shepherd. Its heartbeat was faint, its blood loss critical. The bullet had lodged low in the abdomen, but hadn't punctured any vital organs. After the surgery, I tore off my gloves, sweat tracing a path down my spine despite the chilly room. Linda exhaled in relief. He'll live. The man stood silently the entire time, watching. He never asked about the cost, never panicked like most pet owners would. Only when I turned to him did he reach into his coat and pull out a rough textured white card. No name. Just a phone number, embossed faintly. My boss wants to thank the doctor, he said. Then he left, as quickly as he had come. I stood still for a moment at the clinic door, watching the red taillights disappear into the mist. Sophie stepped outside, clutching her workbook tightly, eyes turned up to me. Mom, I think you know that man, don't you? I swallowed hard. Something in the way he walked, the way he looked at me, cautious, yet unmistakably familiar. A part of me had recognized it. The past I thought I had buried for 11 years, it seemed, had never truly gone away. If you've stayed with us this far and feel a growing curiosity stirring within you, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video to help spread these heartfelt stories to more people. Dear Single Mom is here to bring you deeply moving, honest, and emotionally rich tales of family, loss, hope, and healing. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment and share your location so we can see just how far these stories have reached and the hearts they've touched. Now, let's continue with part 2, where the truth slowly begins to surface and a past once thought buried quietly finds its way back. I stood in silence at the clinic doorway long after the black SUV vanished into the thin veil of mist that had settled across the road. My hand was clenched tightly around the rough white card, the one with nothing but a single phone number. No name, no address, no message. Inside, Linda was cleaning the surgical tools, and Sophie stepped out from the break room, moving slowly, as if weighing something on her mind. Mom, I'm sure he knows you. The way he looked at you, like someone who knew you a long time ago. I knelt to tuck the loose strands of hair from her forehead, trying to offer a smile, but inside I felt tangled, like 1,000 threads pulling in different directions. It's not every night someone shows up with a dog hit by a bullet, and it's not every night you feel the past watching you from the dark. 3 days later, while I was still debating whether to call the number on that card, a letter arrived at the clinic. There was no return address, just a cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax in an old-fashioned way. Inside was an invitation to a charity gala for a mountain wildlife rescue organization. The event would take place that weekend at the Biltmore Hotel, a place so elegant I'd never once set foot inside. The invitation read clearly, "Honored guest, welcome to Bring Family." I placed the letter on the desk, my eyes lingering on that black ink, as Linda spoke from behind me. "You're not seriously thinking about going, are you?" I hadn't even had a chance to answer when Sophie's voice rose from behind. "Mom, can I come with you? I've never been to a big hotel before." There was something in her eyes, that soft glow of excitement, that made it impossible to say no. Maybe it really was just a thank you. Maybe I was reading too much into it. In the end, I nodded. On Saturday evening, Sophie and I stepped into the grand lobby of the Biltmore. The chandelier light spilled down like stars across the polished marble floor. Guests moved through the room in elegant clothes, soft jazz rising from a far corner. Sophie wore a cream-colored dress Linda had picked out, her hair pulled up in a neat bun. She held my hand tightly, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar beauty around her. For me, it felt like every step was carrying me closer to a door I'd kept shut for 11 years. We were led to a table near the center of the room. I hadn't even taken my seat when Sophie let out a happy cry. "Mom, look! Balloons!" And off she went, chasing a cluster shaped like a dog in the far corner. I followed, but as I stepped past a heavy red velvet curtain dividing two parts of the hall, I stopped short. Sophie stood in front of a tall man in a perfectly cut black suit, his dark hair threaded with silver, deep blue eyes fixed on me without blinking. Time stood still. Ethan Bennett. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. For 11 years, I'd wondered if a day like this would ever come, if I'd even recognize him. And now, there he was, just a few steps away. "Mom, I know him. I saw his picture in the tin box in your drawer." Sophie looked up, curiosity shining in her eyes. "Mister, I think you're my dad." Her voice cut through the quiet like a crack of thunder. Ethan froze. I saw his mouth press into a tight line, his eyes flicker with something sharp and painful. He didn't speak, just slowly lowered his gaze to Sophie. I rushed forward, pulling her gently to me. "I'm sorry. She was just wondering," I stammered, my hands trembling. Ethan didn't look away from me. He spoke softly, almost a whisper. "Claire, I didn't think you still had that picture." I said nothing. 1,000 questions, 1,000 buried hurts, rose all at once. But the only thing I could manage to say was a single sentence. "Why are you here?" Ethan looked at me for a long moment, then turned to Sophie. "We need to talk. Could you give me 10 minutes? And in that moment, I knew that whether I was ready or not, the truth was beginning to rise, after all these years buried in silence. I sat in the private room of the Biltmore Hotel, a space set aside for honored guests, though now it felt more like a silent chamber filled with questions that had yet to find their answers. Sophie sat between Ethan and me, her small hand clinging to the sleeve of my dress. Her eyes moved back and forth between the two of us, and I could see clearly what was stirring in her mind. The question she had just asked hung in the air, unanswered. No one had denied it. No one had confirmed it. The room felt suspended in stillness, until Sophie turned to me, her voice soft but certain. "Mom, is he my dad?" I didn't know where to begin. I had thought about this day, many times, but I never imagined it would arrive like this, in front of Ethan, in front of our daughter, in the middle of a glittering party, surrounded by strangers and curious eyes just beyond the glass walls. I took a deep breath and turned to her. "I'll explain, but I need you to listen with a calm heart. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. I looked over at him, searching his face, silently asking if this was the right moment. He gave a small nod. I turned back to her. "Many years ago, when I was young, I fell in love with someone. Someone kind, intelligent, and also complicated. That person was Ethan. We dreamed of building a life together, of starting a family. We believed we'd be together forever. But then something happened, and he had to leave, without a word. I was heartbroken. When I found out I was pregnant with you, he was already gone. I raised you alone." Sophie said nothing at first. Her eyes were wide, her lashes fluttering as she blinked slowly. "So he really is my dad?" Ethan raised his hand, as if to reach for hers, but stopped halfway. His voice was low, thick with emotion. "Yes. You are my daughter. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there all these years. That wasn't my choice." Sophie still didn't respond, but I could see her small shoulders tense, as though she were bracing herself against a storm building inside. She turned to me again. "You didn't tell me because you were mad at him." I held her hand tight, shaking my head. "No, sweetheart. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid you'd be disappointed. Afraid you'd be hurt. And I was afraid I would fall apart if I had to explain it all. You deserved to know, but I never knew when the right time would be." Ethan looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I left, I didn't know you existed. And when I found out, it was already too late. I had gone too far down a road I couldn't turn back from right away. But I never stopped thinking about your mom. And now, seeing you here, there are no words to describe what this moment means to me. Sophie stayed quiet for a long while. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, "That night, when you brought the hurt dog in, that was you, wasn't it?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. His name is Max. He's mine. I knew your mom worked as a vet. I needed to know she was okay. When Max got hurt, it gave me a reason, a chance to see her again. And then I saw you." Sophie's eyes seemed to brighten just slightly, though doubt still lingered there. "If you're my dad, why did you make my mom so sad?" Her question caught me in the chest. Ethan lowered his head. "Because I wasn't strong enough to fight what I was caught up in. Because I made the wrong choice. But I want to make things right, if you and your mom will let me." Sophie didn't respond right away. She simply leaned her head against my shoulder, her eyes still on Ethan, full of confusion and quiet thought. I ran my fingers gently through her hair, my heart heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. Whether this reunion would lead to healing or more pain, I didn't know. But what I did know was that from this moment on, nothing would be simple. Her question had been answered, but everything that would come after would be a journey none of us could predict. I led Sophie back to the banquet table after the brief but deeply unsettling conversation in the private room. She didn't say a word, but her small hand clung to mine like an anchor in a sea of rising emotions. Ethan walked beside us, keeping just enough distance not to press into my space, yet close enough to show he wasn't going to disappear again. The gala continued around us, lights shimmering, laughter and chatter filling the air as though nothing unusual had just taken place. But inside me, everything had changed. As Sophie bowed her head over the plate of untouched food, pushing it around in small circles, Ethan leaned slightly toward me, his voice low and steady like wind brushing across the tablecloth. "Claire, I owe you a real explanation. About everything." I looked up, meeting his eyes. "Then say it. Right now." He hesitated, then began. "When I left 11 years ago, it wasn't because I wanted to walk away. I didn't have a choice. My family, Claire, they're not like most. You used to ask why I'd vanish without warning, why there were calls in the middle of the night I never explained. It was because I was living two lives. One with you, chasing a quiet dream of normalcy, and another with the organization I was born into. A world built on money, power, and violence." My chest tightened. My heart was pounding against my ribs. Ethan continued, his voice trembling just enough to show the weight he carried. "When my father died, I was forced into a role I never wanted. If I had stayed with you, you and the child I didn't even know you were carrying would have been in danger. I thought I could pull away, but I was wrong. There were people who didn't want to let me go. People who would do anything to keep me tied to that life. I thought leaving you was the only way to keep you safe." I didn't get the chance to respond. A sudden, sharp sound sliced through the air, glass shattering. All around us, people ducked and screamed. My instinct took over. I pulled Sophie into my arms and threw my body over hers, pressing her down into the chair. Ethan moved fast, stepping in front of us, his back shielding both me and our daughter. Footsteps thundered across the floor as security rushed into the ballroom. A single bullet, clean and deliberate. It had torn through the grand window and lodged into a stone pillar just steps from where we sat. Ethan shouted something to a man nearby, a signal exchanged with a single look. The man pulled out a phone, spoke quickly, then gave a nod. Ethan turned to me, pale but calm in that strange, chilling way that only someone who had lived through danger could manage. "We have to go. Now." I didn't argue. There was only one thing on my mind: get Sophie out. Ethan grabbed my hand, scooped Sophie into his arms, and led us through a side corridor where a car was already waiting. No headlights, no license plate in plain sight. I didn't ask questions. I didn't have the breath to form any. When the car door slammed shut, I sat beside Ethan in silence, arms wrapped tight around our trembling daughter. His hands gripped the wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror over and over as though every set of headlights behind us might bring death. I turned to him, my voice raw. "Who did that?" He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, someone who was once a friend, now an enemy, the man I replaced. "He doesn't want me to walk away. And now, he knows about you. About Sophie." I nodded slowly, though inside, every thought was screaming. I had feared that Ethan's return would bring trouble, but I had never imagined that trouble would arrive in the form of a bullet flying through the air, tearing through the fragile peace I had worked so hard to build over the years. And now, I had no choice but to walk the road he'd reopened. Even if it led into the dark. Even if it was dangerous. Even if I had no idea where it would take us. The road out of the city was swallowed by thick darkness, broken only by the sweep of headlights gliding past the silent silhouettes of trees that stood like sentinels, still and watchful. Ethan drove in the opposite direction of everything I had ever known. Away from Asheville. Away from the little clinic I had built with bare hands and long hours. Away from the quiet life I had spent 11 years trying to create. Sophie lay curled in my lap, her eyes closed but her fingers still clutching the hem of my shirt as if letting go might cause everything to disappear. I stroked her hair gently, my mind a storm of questions and memories. I didn't ask Ethan where he was taking us. Part of me didn't want to know. Part of me already did. The way his voice had shifted in the car earlier told me enough. A house, hidden deep in the woods, one he once called the last safe point, if things ever spiraled out of control. After more than an hour of driving, the SUV turned onto a stone-paved path concealed behind towering pines. An iron gate opened slowly as we approached. No voices, only the low whine of machinery breaking the silence. The house revealed itself like a solitary fortress in the forest. Black-tiled roof, gray stone walls, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting slivers of moonlight. It wasn't ornate or extravagant, but solid, fortified, and steeped in mystery. A man waited outside. Middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a dark leather coat. Ethan gestured toward him. "This is Tom, the only person I still trust." Tom opened the door, reached in gently, and carried Sophie inside. I stepped over the threshold of stone, and was immediately enveloped by a quiet that felt almost sacred. The space smelled of pine and firewood, warm and earthy. Ethan led me upstairs to a large bedroom already prepared with 2 small beds and a few pristine toys resting on wooden shelves. I laid Sophie down, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, then stood at the bedside for a long while. Ethan remained behind me, silent. Finally he spoke. "I know you have 100 questions, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I can't leave you and Sophie out there anymore." I turned to him. There was no rage in my eyes now, only exhaustion. "I lived all these years without you. Do you really think showing up now means everything goes back to the way it was?" Ethan gave a small, sorrowful nod. "No, I know it doesn't, but I hope I can fix something, at least protect you both." I didn't respond. We went back downstairs to the main room, where Tom was boiling water and setting out a few simple dishes. I took a sip of hot tea, though the chill inside me hadn't lifted. Ethan pulled open a wooden drawer and took out a small, dented tin box. He opened it, revealing a handful of old photographs. Faded shots of us when we were young, of the cabin we once dreamed of building together, and then one blurry ultrasound image. My breath caught. That was when you were pregnant with Sophie. I got the photo from someone I knew who worked at the hospital. Your name wasn't on it, but I knew. That was the moment I realized just how much I'd lost. I set the cup down, my hands trembling. "Then why didn't you come back?" "Because coming back then would have pulled you into the nightmare I was trying to escape. And now, he knows about Sophie. I can't run anymore." I asked him, quietly. "Who is he?" "Victor Langston. He used to run the organization. I replaced him. But Victor didn't take kindly to being pushed aside. And now, he wants revenge. He's been watching you. And when he saw Sophie, he knew I had a weakness." The floor beneath me felt as if it had shifted. Ethan placed his hands on the table, his voice steady but low. "I don't know how long I can keep you both safe, but I won't run. Not again. Not ever again." I looked around the house. Every wall seemed to hold pieces of a life I had never known, fragments of a man I had once loved beyond reason. And now, though I wasn't ready to forgive, I also couldn't deny that some small, fragile part of my heart still stirred in his presence. I just didn't know if that part could be made whole again, or if it was destined to break one final time. The first morning in the secluded house unfolded so quietly that I almost didn't notice the sunlight slipping through the heavy curtains. Sophie was still fast asleep beside me, her small arm wrapped tightly around mine, as if letting go would cause everything from the day before to vanish like a dream. I sat up, moving carefully so as not to wake her, and stepped onto the cool wooden floor, feeling the hush of this unfamiliar place settle around me like fog. Downstairs, the scent of coffee mingled with the soft clinking sounds of the kitchen. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw Ethan standing awkwardly by the coffee machine, struggling to make sense of its buttons. He wore a simple shirt, his hair still tousled from sleep, and in that moment, he looked nothing like a man with a past woven through violence and shadows. He turned when he saw me, offering a small smile. I'm attempting something that resembles breakfast. I gave a quiet nod. No smile in return, but no coldness either. We need to talk. Just not now. He understood and nodded without pressing. I had just poured a cup of coffee when I heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Sophie appeared, still in her pajamas, hair tangled and eyes drowsy. But what surprised me most was that she didn't walk toward me. She went straight to Ethan. "What are you doing?" Ethan crouched slightly, his voice barely more than a breath. "Making scrambled eggs. Not sure they'll be any good." Sophie paused, thoughtful, then said, "Mom makes them really well, but I want to try yours. Just to see." The simple statement froze Ethan in place. I saw his hand tremble slightly as he placed the first serving onto her plate. Sophie climbed into the chair, waiting with the seriousness of a tiny food critic. Ethan set the plate in front of her, then stepped back. She took one bite, frowned for a second, then suddenly burst into laughter. "Not bad, but the eggs are a little burned." Ethan laughed too, and for the first time in so many years, I saw that same warm light return to his eyes. After breakfast, Sophie pulled him outside into the backyard. The two of them sat on an old wooden swing hanging beneath a wide maple tree. I stood quietly on the porch, watching from a distance. Sophie was talking, her hands waving through the air as if painting a story. Ethan listened closely, nodding, smiling. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a small stone or maybe one of the tiny dolls she liked to carry, and showed it to him. He bent over to examine it, said something that made her laugh again, loud and clear. That sound, that look in his eyes. In 11 years, no one had ever looked at my daughter like that. And Sophie, though she had only known the truth for barely 2 days, was already beginning to open her heart to this man in a way I could neither stop nor fully understand. I turned to go back inside before they noticed I was watching. That's when Tom appeared through the side entrance. His voice was tight, drawn like a wire pulled to its breaking point. "He's made contact. Victor knows you're here. We need an exit plan if things go bad." Ethan entered just behind him, having heard the final words. He didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly. "No one touches this place without us knowing. I've set up motion sensors and surveillance all through the woods." Tom added, "We picked up some movement last night. Might have been wildlife, might not." Ethan looked at me, and for the first time since all this began, I saw clear tension in his face. He didn't want Sophie to be frightened. I understood. I stepped outside and called her in. She came running, hair windblown, cheeks flushed. "Mom, Dad told me about the time he fell into a river and got chased by fish." She giggled uncontrollably. "Dad." It was the first time she had called him that. Ethan froze, then bowed his head slightly, as though trying to steady something fragile inside himself. I rested my hand on her shoulder and said gently, "Go get cleaned up and dressed, sweetheart." She headed upstairs, and I turned to Ethan. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "I don't deserve that, but I'll do everything I can to be worthy of it, even just once." I didn't reply. But I knew in my heart, amid the threats closing in, something delicate was beginning to kindle again. Not through promises or apologies, but through presence, through shared moments, and through the sound of a child's laughter echoing from an old swing beneath a thick canopy of autumn leaves. I stood quietly in the bedroom, the soft light of late afternoon casting a pale golden hue across the floor through the thin curtain. Outside the window, Sophie was playing with Tom, her laughter rising faintly through the glass, while Ethan checked the cameras along the edge of the property. Everything appeared calm, still, almost peaceful. But inside me was a different kind of storm, one without sirens or noise, made only of old wounds that had never quite healed, of unanswered questions, and of a feeling I had spent years burying that now quietly stirred again. There were times I had imagined Ethan's return. In some versions, I slapped him in a crowded room for the years he had left us behind. In others, I ran into his arms, forgiving everything at the sound of an apology. But not once had I pictured my daughter calling him Dad, with a smile so open, so free of bitterness, as if no years had ever been lost. And it was that image that unsettled me most. Ethan wasn't the same man I remembered, at least. Not in the way he looked at Sophie. It wasn't guilt he wore like a mask, or some dutiful attempt to be the father he'd never been. It was something quieter, deeper. The gaze of a man who carried honest regret, and who, for the first time, was seeing a piece of himself walking and laughing in the world. But the question that kept circling in me was this: was that enough? I remembered the nights I held my daughter close as she cried, unable to explain why other kids had a dad and she didn't. I remembered the first time Sophie burned with fever, and I stood alone in the ER lobby, shivering from both fear and cold. I remembered her first birthday, when I sang to her beside a single candle on a tiny cake, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. No one knew how I survived those years. And Ethan, in all of them, had become nothing more than a ghost familiar, yet distant. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped tightly in my lap. If I opened my heart now, would he stay this time? If I let Sophie believe in this man, would she one day be abandoned all over again? But if I denied Ethan a chance, would I be stealing from my daughter something she had a right to, something irreplaceable? I heard footsteps in the hallway, then a soft knock at the door. It was Ethan. He stepped in, the smell of oil and pine clinging faintly to him, his hands still smudged from adjusting the equipment out near the forest line. He didn't come too close. He leaned against the doorframe, his posture hesitant. I know it's not easy to trust me again, and I don't expect you to, but I'm not running anymore. I want to be here, not for what we had, but for what we could have now, and in the days ahead. You don't have to forgive me. Maybe you never will. But please, don't close the door on me completely. I looked at him, and something rose in my chest, fragile, unfamiliar. This wasn't the feverish love of our younger years. It was something quieter, something that had once been planted, then left untended, and was now, against all odds, beginning to sprout again beneath the hardened soil of the past. I took a deep breath and stood slowly. I don't know how far I can trust you, Ethan. I don't know what's waiting for us down this road. But I know one thing. My daughter is laughing more in the past 2 days than she has in the past year. And if I do anything to silence that laughter, then I'm the one to blame. Ethan stepped forward, not to embrace me, but to rest his hand gently on my shoulder. A wordless promise. Thank you, Claire. If you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I won't disappear again. I didn't reply. But I didn't pull away either. And maybe, for the first time in 11 years, I let my heart be still for a moment. No defenses, no bitterness, just still. And in that quiet space, I realized something. Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't begin with an embrace. Sometimes, it starts with simply making space for someone to stand beside you, in the middle of all the wreckage, and try again. From the beginning, the afternoon sky darkened faster than it should have, heavy clouds gathering on the distant horizon like a warning whispered by the wind. We had just finished a simple dinner, just the three of us, when Tom entered the room, a satellite phone clutched tightly in his hand. He said nothing, simply handed it to Ethan, his eyes taut with unspoken urgency. Ethan glanced at the screen, and in an instant, his expression hardened. He looked at me not with fear, but with a quiet, grim certainty. Then he stepped out onto the front porch of the house. I didn't follow, but my heartbeat had already quickened. Through the glass, I could see him standing motionless, listening. One hand clutched the railing, the other holding the phone to his ear. He didn't speak a word until the call ended, and when he came back inside, his eyes had changed. Gone was the softness he held for Sophie, the careful caution he wore around me. In its place was something cold, sharpened like the man I had first seen that night in the glow of the SUV's headlights. It's Victor. He wants to meet. Ethan's voice was rough, almost hoarse. I stood up, tension rising like a tide. Where? He didn't say. Just that his men will come, and that I'll want to hear what he has to say. My hands clenched. I don't like this. Ethan nodded. Neither do I. But if I don't go, he won't stop. And I know Victor, he doesn't make threats for nothing. Night settled fast, thick as ink. A gray-black car parked several 100 feet from the gate. No one got out. Tom did the sweep first, then gave Ethan a short nod. Ethan turned to me and Sophie. Don't open the door for anyone but Tom. If something happens, there's a tunnel in the basement. It leads through the woods to the other side. I'll be back before midnight. I couldn't hide the worry in my eyes, but I nodded anyway. Ethan stepped out, now wearing a compact gun at his hip, something I hadn't seen on him since we arrived. The car disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the silence of night. I couldn't sleep. Sophie had drifted off, curled tightly around the stuffed animal Ethan bought her at a gas station on the way here. I sat on the edge of the hearth, staring into the soft flicker of the fire, listening to every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind. Just past 10, the sound of a car engine stirred the air outside. My heart stopped. The door opened. It was Ethan, but his face was pale, lips pressed tight. Every step weighted like it took effort to move forward. He entered without a word, gesturing for Tom to secure the perimeter before turning back to me. He didn't come alone. 3 men followed him in, armed. He wanted to remind me who he still is. But it wasn't just for show. I rose to my feet, bracing myself. Ethan sat, pulled a folded sheet of paper from inside his coat. This is a list of places Victor has been watching for the last 6 months. Your clinic. A school near our house. I felt the blood drain from my face. What else did he say? Ethan looked up, his voice low and cold. He said, "If I don't return to the organization, if I don't take back my position and cut ties with you and Sophie for good, he'll start sending pieces of our past to the media. And if that doesn't break me," he said, "the next message he sends to you will be written in blood." I collapsed into the nearest chair, all my old fears suddenly real and solid. Every nightmare I had spent years keeping at bay now creeping into the corners of this house. Ethan's voice cut through my silence, steel in his eyes. But he said one more thing. "I have 12 days. 12 days to choose between family and power, between love and survival." I looked at him, my eyes stinging. "And what do you choose?" He didn't hesitate. "I choose to protect you and Sophie, even if it means facing everything I once called my own." I nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees twisted and groaned under its force. Inside, something inside me cracked, but something else hardened. We were no longer drifting in uncertainty. We had crossed the line. There was no more room for hesitation, no more time for doubt. From this moment forward, we would stand together, or not at all. The next morning, the air inside the house felt thick and heavy, weighted by the aftermath of what Ethan had brought back the night before. Tom had stayed up through the night, sweeping every inch of the security system, while Ethan remained in the study, hunched over a map spread wide across the desk. I stepped in just as the first slant of sunlight broke through the trees, its pale light brushing across the hardwood floor. Red ink dotted the map points of concern, possible entry paths. At least 3 trails in the forest showed signs of being disturbed. One of them, Ethan was certain, was the route Victor's men had used. Tom returned from the woods carrying a small device in his gloved hand. A recorder. Someone had planted it beneath the back balcony. Victor wasn't just threatening us. He was listening. Ethan held the device in his palm, his knuckles whitening. His voice dropped low. "We can't just wait anymore. He thinks I'll run. But he forgot one thing." I looked at him and recognized what had surfaced again in his eyes, the look of someone preparing to enter a fight with no intention of turning back. I had seen it before, long ago, and now it was back, not for revenge or power, but for something far more fragile. Family. The one thing he never had a chance to protect. Ethan made a call to a man named Marcus, a former FBI agent who had once worked alongside him during an undercover operation years ago. He didn't need to explain much. Marcus understood the stakes. 2 hours later, he arrived at the house, bringing with him a metal case and a specialized laptop. In the study, he and Ethan reviewed footage from the perimeter cameras and analyzed audio patterns from the intercepted device. I stood outside the room, watching them through the glass. In that moment, Ethan no longer looked like the man who had once walked out on me. He wasn't the ghost of a past I had fought to forget. He was the man doing everything he could to shield me and our daughter from a past that had clawed its way to our doorstep. That afternoon, Tom led Ethan and Marcus into the woods, following a new route one Victor likely hadn't accounted for. They carried drones and tracking equipment. I stayed behind with Sophie, doing everything I could to keep the day feeling ordinary. We read together on the couch, pieced together puzzles, and Sophie told me about the story Ethan had shared with her under the maple tree. "Mom, I don't think Dad is like I imagined. I thought he'd be scary, but he's actually really gentle." I smiled, though my eyes stung. She didn't know the man she was talking about had once been the right hand of a brutal power broker, had lived in shadows most of his life. But I also knew the only light powerful enough to make Ethan turn back from that world was the little girl sitting in front of me now. That night, when they returned, Ethan carried a stack of documents. Among them was a detailed breakdown of Victor's financial channels' assets used to fuel his operations. But more importantly, they had pinpointed his location, another estate, buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains, hidden in a place no one would think to look. Ethan unfolded the map, placing a finger on a marked spot. "If we strike first, we have the upper hand," Marcus added. "We don't have much time. He's issued his ultimatum. He's betting you'll hesitate. We need to make him regret that." Ethan looked at me, his face unreadable. "I know you don't want Sophie caught in this, but if we don't take control now, you and she will always live in fear." I nodded slowly. Not because I fully believed in the plan, but because I believed in Ethan. There was no way back now. The enemy had shown his face, and this time, we would decide when it ended. Ethan locked the files away and turned to Tom and Marcus. "We leave at dawn, but tonight, Let Sophie sleep. Let her rest without fear. Because tomorrow might be the last peaceful night before we step into something we may never return from. Before dawn, when the forest was still draped in cold mist, and the world held its breath in perfect stillness, Ethan had already stepped out of the study. I saw him standing alone on the balcony, holding a small photograph in his hand, the one of Sophie grinning wide on her 5th birthday. He stared at it for a long time, not blinking, as if anchoring himself to a memory he was afraid to lose if he wandered too far. Then, gently, he tucked it back into his wallet, as if sealing away a piece of himself for safekeeping. When I stepped outside, he didn't turn around. He only asked, his voice barely louder than the rustle of leaves, "If this ends, would you be willing to give me a beginning?" I didn't answer right away. That question was too big, too heavy to hold with a promise. But I knew this much: there are roads a person cannot walk alone. And if he truly meant to lay down the weight of his past, someone would need to witness the first unsteady steps forward. Ethan and Marcus had made the decision to reach out directly to someone named Wade Emerson, a high-ranking FBI agent who had once led the investigation into the very syndicate Victor controlled. Marcus had worked alongside him on an old deep-cover case nearly a decade ago. If there was one man who could be trusted to not look away when things got dangerous, it was Wade. The meeting was set at an abandoned railway station near the North Carolina border. Ethan didn't bring a weapon. He carried only a thick folder of documents taken from Victor's hidden base, along with a list of names. Politicians, CEOs, powerful men who had quietly protected Victor's empire for years. When Wade appeared, he wasn't alone. 2 younger agents flanked him, keeping their distance. Wade's gaze settled on Ethan, deep and unreadable. He stepped forward and shook his hand. "Been a long time. I didn't think I'd ever see you return to this path." Ethan handed him the file. "I'm not coming back. I'm trying to end it. But I can't do it alone. You need to know what Victor's doing, and what he's planning. If we don't stop him now, no one will." Wade flipped through the file, his expression tightening. Without a word, he signaled one of his men to retrieve an encrypted device from the car. He turned to Ethan, his voice dropping. "If I help you, you'll need to cut all ties to the organization. That includes any armed retaliation. Are you ready for that?" Ethan didn't answer at once. Then slowly, he removed the metal watch from his wrist, the only thing he still carried from his former life. He placed it on the weathered wood table in the center of the old station. "I'm ready, and I won't pick up a gun again. But you have to promise me no one touches Claire and Sophie." Wade nodded. "Protecting witnesses is what we do best. But if you want full safety, you'll have to disappear off the radar." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Marcus. "Can you take care of them? Can you make sure no one finds them?" Marcus nodded. "I'll get them where no one can reach." Ethan gave one last nod and turned back to Wade. "Then let's begin." On the way back to the house, Ethan said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on the trees, as if already rehearsing what it would mean to vanish from everything he had just started to rebuild. Only when we were home again did he finally sit beside me and take my hand. He told me he had turned everything over to the FBI, that he was done carrying the shadows with him, but it also meant he couldn't stay with us for now. Not if we were to be safe. Not if this was going to end the right way. My heart clenched. He said Wade would put him on the stand, and if things went well, Victor would be arrested along with everyone who helped keep him hidden. But until that happened, Ethan would need to disappear. The further, the better. I looked at him for a long time, then asked quietly, "What about us?" He held my hand tighter. "If you still believe in us, then we're still here. And if you don't, I'll live in a way that proves I deserve a chance to earn it." From the hallway, Sophie appeared, eyes still fogged with sleep. "Daddy, tomorrow will you help me draw Max again?" Ethan knelt and pulled her into his arms, his voice tight with emotion. "I'll always keep my promises. Even when I'm not right beside you, I'm still your dad." I turned away, hiding the tears that came too easily. For the first time in years, Ethan had put down the weapon, and I understood then that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't to fight but to walk away from everything they once were. Not out of fear, but because love, real love, sometimes demands a different kind of strength. The kind that says, "I'll start over. For you. For us." I don't remember how long I stood at the second-floor window, the one that overlooked the narrow road winding out from the house into the trees. I only remember that the morning light that day didn't carry its usual hush. Instead, it carried an ache, silent and heavy. Ethan had left before dawn, before Sophie stirred in her sleep. He left behind a letter, short and slanted in his familiar hand, written in haste but not in fear. He said he wouldn't say goodbye because goodbye sounded like an end. And to him, this was only another beginning. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it between the pages of an old book, as if trying to hold on to whatever part of him still lingered in this house. The days that followed passed slowly, as if even time itself wasn't sure whether to move forward or turn back to where everything began. I took care of Sophie, tidied up the little garden behind the house, read a few pages each night. But what I didn't tell anyone was that I began to notice Ethan's changes not while he was here but in the silence he left behind. Ethan, once, had always kept the world at a safe distance. There had been something distant about him, something guarded, almost cold, like a man constantly bracing for the worst. But this time, his gaze, especially when he looked at Sophie, held none of that. It wasn't the look of a man haunted by what he'd lost. It was the look of someone who had finally realized what he still had, and what he'd do anything to protect it. I remembered the last morning he stood in the kitchen, awkwardly slicing bread for Sophie's breakfast. He wasn't the man who had once moved with quiet authority through clandestine meetings. He was a father, fumbling to pour milk without spilling. I remembered how he watched her sleep, that look in his eyes that held both gratitude and regret. And though he never said it, I knew Ethan was learning how to be someone he had never been taught to be. There were no more unexplained silences, no more disappearing in the night, no more anger masking hurt. Instead, there were small questions. Do you need help? And quiet moments where he simply listened as I spoke about the fear of raising a child alone. He didn't offer vague promises. He only said, "I'll be here, one day at a time, if you let me." And I realized that, for the first time in 11 years, Ethan wasn't trying to make me fall in love with him again. He was trying to become someone worthy of being loved. One afternoon, while sorting through an old bookshelf, I found a small wooden box that had once been his, left behind in the desk drawer. Inside was a notebook, Ethan's. Not a journal filled with tactical notes or business plans, as I had expected, but something far more vulnerable. A diary. Letters, really. Written to Sophie. The entries were clumsy, simple, full of the halting honesty of a man trying to find his voice as a father. "Today, you said my eggs were better than Mom's. I smiled all afternoon." Or, "You asked why the rain made me happy. Because it meant I got to stay home with you and Mom." I read each line slowly, my throat tightening. The man who wrote those words was not the Ethan I had known 11 years ago. He was not the man who left without a word. He was a father, trying to rewrite his story starting with a little girl named Sophie. And me, though I had once sworn I would never look back, found myself unable to ignore what was beginning to grow in my heart. Not out of nostalgia, but because the present was gently persuading me that people can change, if they truly want to. And Ethan had changed. Not with promises, but with presence, with quiet, with mornings filled with sunlight and no shadows from the past stretching long across the floor. Maybe I was still afraid. Maybe I wasn't ready to say the word love out loud again. But somewhere deep inside, I had started to believe in something I once thought impossible. That some people after everything do come back. Not to relive what was lost, but to write something new. And this time, maybe Ethan would be one of them. That afternoon, just as I'd finished folding the last of the winter clothes and was reaching for the kettle to make tea, Sophie came barreling in from the backyard, shouting breathlessly for me. "Mom, you have to come see this. Right now." Before I could even hang the dish towel, she had my hand in hers and was already pulling me toward the door. The late autumn wind had grown cooler, but the sunlight still filtered gently through the golden canopy of maple leaves above, casting flickering patches of warmth across the ground. And there, beneath the tree where Sophie often sat to read, stood Ethan. He was waiting, holding a handful of wildflowers. I knew he must have picked from the hill behind the house. The breeze tousled his hair, and when he looked up at me, I felt it something quiet and certain was about to happen. I slowed my steps, while Sophie plopped herself onto the old swing, crossing her legs as if she were settling in for a show. Ethan stepped toward me, saying nothing at first. He held out the bouquet, his eyes watching mine as though searching for the smallest shift, the tiniest sign. Then he spoke. "I don't have a ring. I don't have a perfect plan. And I'm sure as hell not the perfect man you deserve. But there's one thing I know for certain. If I don't say this today, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." My breath caught. My heart was already beating too fast. He took a deep breath, then slowly lowered himself to one knee, still holding the flowers. "Claire, I'm not asking you to forget everything I did wrong. I'm not asking you to pretend the past didn't happen. I'm just asking for one thing. Let me walk with you through whatever comes next. Not to fix what's broken, but to rebuild together. With you, with Sophie, with all that I lost, and all that I never knew how to hold before." I stood there, not frozen in shock, but in quiet overwhelm. Maybe I had imagined this moment once or twice in passing, but never like this. Not this soft, not this real, no spotlight, no grand gestures, just the man I had loved, lost, and somehow found again asking for a chance. In the quiet of an autumn afternoon, in the place we had started over without even realizing it, I looked down at Ethan. Then I glanced at Sophie. She had her chin in her palm, eyes wide and bright, giving me the tiniest nod of encouragement. I reached out and took the flowers from his hand, then leaned in close enough for only him to hear. I don't need a ring. I need someone who stays. Someone who's willing to walk through the past and still choose to be here every single morning. If you're that man, then my answer is yes. Ethan exhaled, long and slow, like he'd been holding his breath for an entire winter. He stood and wrapped his arms around me, not tight, not rushed, but just enough for me to know I was exactly where I needed to be. Sophie came running over, throwing her arms around both of us. Her voice rang out, full of joy and wonder. So that means I finally get a real family, right? I bent down to kiss her forehead, and Ethan did the same. Yes, sweetheart. Not a perfect family, but ours. That evening, there was no celebration, no cake, no glittering lights, just the three of us around the table, sharing a simple dinner pasta that Ethan had been practicing all week. I laughed at how clumsy he was trying to stir the sauce, but when he looked at me across the table, I saw everything I needed in his eyes. After the meal, he pulled out a small notebook. This is the journal I started for Sophie. He placed it on the table, then handed me another, still blank. And this one, I want to write with you, a new story. No more shadows, no more running, just days that are real and truly ours. I opened to the first page. The first thing I wrote wasn't a date, it was a promise. That from now on, we wouldn't look back in regret. We would move forward with hope. And in that quiet evening, with no audience, and no need for papers or rings, I knew I had just received the most honest proposal of my life. A promise, and a chance to begin again. Not to rewrite everything, but to continue. This time, together. We were married on a sunlit Sunday morning, the kind of morning that holds its breath in quiet reverence. The forest, still dressed in the soft golds of late autumn, swayed gently in the breeze, and the air was cool enough that my simple white dress moved with the wind like a whispered promise. There was no church, no choir, no endless guest list, just the backyard bathed in light, a few bundles of wildflowers Ethan and Sophie had picked from the hill behind the house, a wooden table holding a homemade wedding cake Tom had baked himself, and a circle of wooden chairs set out for the handful of friends we called family. Marcus stood at the center, officiating the ceremony in a soft gray sweater instead of a suit, a small notebook in his hand, his voice steady as he read the vows. I looked around and saw Sophie beaming in her lavender princess dress, her hair braided neatly down both sides, holding a smaller bouquet that matched mine. She couldn't sit still. Her eyes darted between Ethan and me as if she were afraid the whole moment might vanish before she could fully believe it. Ethan stood before me in a light gray suit he had borrowed from Marcus. His hand was wrapped tightly around mine, and his eyes never left mine, not for a second. When Marcus reached the final question, Ethan didn't read from a card. He looked straight at me, his voice not loud, but clear enough to be heard by everyone. I used to think I wasn't worthy of love. But today, standing here with you, with our daughter watching, I understand that the greatest fear isn't losing the past. It's never believing you can have a future. I promise I won't disappear again. I won't go silent when you need a word. And I'll never let you carry your fears alone. I smiled, tears stinging my eyes, and replied with a simple vow of my own. I promise not to let the past get in the way of the happiness I have right here in front of me. And if one day I lose my way, I'll only have to look into our daughter's eyes to remember just how much I loved you. When Marcus pronounced us husband and wife, Sophie was the first to leap from her chair, running toward us and wrapping her arms around both of us in a hug so full of joy it made the world feel small and sacred. The air around us burst into applause and laughter, warm and genuine. Tom poured homemade apple cider, and Marcus played a soft melody from a small speaker resting on the porch rail. There was no traditional dancing, no formal steps. Ethan simply took my hand and led me onto the stone patio, and we moved slowly, just enough for me to hear his heart beating near mine, just enough to feel the sure, steady rhythm of his steps beside me. Later, while everyone was sharing slices of sweet, spiced wedding cake, Ethan knelt beside Sophie and whispered something into her ear. "Close your eyes. Mom, you too." I raised an eyebrow but played along. When I opened my eyes, Sophie was holding a small box in her trembling hands. She opened it carefully. Inside was a simple silver necklace, a heart-shaped pendant that shimmered in the light. But what stole the breath from my lungs was the engraving inside. "Family is where the heart comes home." Ethan looked at both of us, his voice quiet but more serious than I'd ever heard it. "I can't buy back the years I missed. But I want to begin here with this, so that every time you wear it, you remember. No matter where we are, your mom and I are with you." Sophie flung her arms around his neck, holding him with everything she had. I couldn't speak. I could only reach for Ethan's shoulder, resting my hand there, offering him the only thank you I could manage without words. That day, there was no grand stage, no spotlight, no orchestra, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. That quiet morning, in the glow of sunlight and laughter, became the most sacred chapter of our story. A small wedding, a small gift, and a family slowly, steadily growing from the simplest things. A week after the wedding, I woke earlier than usual. Outside the window, the mist still clung low to the ground, and the forest behind the house seemed to slumber in the quiet of late autumn. Ethan was still asleep, his hand resting loosely over mine, as if, even in sleep, he was holding onto something fragile. I didn't want to leave the warmth of the bed, but the sound of Sophie's laughter echoing from the kitchen pulled me gently into the day. The scent of something baking filled the air as I made my way downstairs. The first thing I saw was Sophie, perched on a little wooden stool, wearing an apron 2 sizes too big, stirring batter with Tom watching over her like a patient teacher. Ethan walked in moments later, his hair tousled, sleep still lingering in his posture. But when he saw us, me smiling in the doorway, Sophie giggling with flour on her nose, his eyes lit up. He didn't need to say anything. I knew he felt what I felt. Peace. It was something unfamiliar, yet deeply real. As if, after everything, we had finally arrived at the place we were meant to be. The days that followed weren't remarkable by any grand measure, but they were full of small, quiet moments I once believed I'd never have. Breakfasts filled with laughter and the soft clink of dishes. Afternoons spent in the garden, Sophie chasing Max, who had finally healed, while Ethan repaired the old wooden gate. Evenings where we read to Sophie until she fell asleep on her father's arm, as though she'd done it her entire life. One night, I asked Ethan if he ever regretted walking away from the world he left behind. He was quiet for a moment, then answered, "Yes, I regret not choosing this sooner. I regret wasting so many years chasing the wrong things. Power, control, survival. When what I should have been chasing was mornings like this. Waking up and knowing I don't have to be alone anymore. The life of shadows, of glancing over his shoulder and living in silence, had become a memory." Marcus called to say it was over. Victor had been arrested. The entire organization had been dismantled. The documents Ethan handed over had done their job. There would be no trial, no long courtroom battles, just a quiet end. The FBI kept their word. They gave us back the life we thought was lost for good. But not everything could be undone. Ethan still carried scars that didn't show. There were nights he'd jolt awake, breath ragged, chased by memories he hadn't yet put to rest. I never asked what he saw. I simply took his hand in mine, so he would know that this time, he didn't have to face the dark alone. Sophie started school in the small town nearby. On her first day, she clung to my hand, eyes scanning the classroom full of strangers. Ethan stood just outside the door. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. He watched her like he was memorizing every second, every step she took, gathering the moments he had missed, one by one. That night, Sophie told us that one of her classmates called her the girl with the coolest dad in the world. Her smile was radiant. Ethan turned away, blinking hard, pretending he didn't need to wipe his eyes. None of us were perfect. I still had days when doubt crept in, when I startled too easily at a knock that lasted too long. Ethan still carried his shadows. And Sophie, as joyful as she was, sometimes asked why we hadn't found our way back to each other sooner. But maybe that's exactly what made this family feel real. Not perfect, but truly ours. I used to believe happiness had to be something grand, something gleaming and flawless, something out of books or movies. But now I know happiness is being able to stop pretending. It's being allowed to be soft, to fall, to fail, and still find someone waiting there, hand outstretched, ready to walk forward with you anyway. One quiet afternoon, while Sophie colored at the kitchen table and Ethan made tea, I sat by the window and looked out at the sunlit backyard, and I smiled, because I knew I needed nothing more. This family, with all its cracks, its missteps, and the slow, imperfect journey back to each other, was the answer I had spent a lifetime waiting for. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, I sat with Ethan on the porch, each of us holding a cup of hot tea. The air had turned crisp, the kind of cool that whispered of winter approaching, and the trees around us rustled faintly as the wind moved through them, carrying the scent of damp wood and something older, something that felt like memory. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze lost in the distance. He didn't speak at first, but I could feel him slipping into the shadows of his thoughts. And then, quietly, he asked, his voice low and slow, "If I hadn't left back then, would things have been different?" I didn't answer right away. That was a question I had asked myself countless times over the years, a question that never brought a clear answer. If he hadn't left, would I still be the same Claire I am now? Would Sophie have grown up in a home with 2 parents? Would she have never asked me, night after night, who her father was? Would I have slept more soundly without the weight of fear pressing on me, alone, raising a child without knowing what came next? But I also knew if Ethan hadn't left, he might never have understood what he stood to lose. And I might never have learned just how strong I could be, carrying the weight of a world I never asked for, all for a child too young to understand the mistakes adults made. I turned to him. Maybe things would have been different, but maybe you never would have truly come back. Sometimes it takes losing something to realize what matters most. Ethan didn't say anything. He just nodded, as if that was all he needed, not an answer, but a moment to face what had once been unspoken. He squeezed my hand gently, his eyes settling on the window to Sophie's room, where the soft glow of her nightlight flickered faintly. "Back then," he said, "I thought I was protecting you both by walking away. But I see now. I wasn't. I was running. I was scared that I wasn't enough, scared that I'd put you in danger. And I let that fear decide for me." I gripped his hand tighter. "I was angry for a long time," I said. "I hated the way you disappeared, like we never meant anything. But eventually, I looked at Sophie, and I saw so much of you in her. And I realized there are things you can't erase, no matter how hurt you are. Love doesn't always leave when people do. Sometimes it stays, quiet and stubborn." Ethan bowed his head. "I'm sorry, not just for leaving, but for making you carry everything alone for so long." I leaned my head against his shoulder. "That's over now. What matters is, you came back, and this time you chose to stay." The wind stirred the leaves overhead, their gentle rustle sounding like a quiet melody, the kind you don't notice until you've been silent long enough. I closed my eyes and let the memories rise slow, deliberate like scenes from a film that played only in the heart. Sleepless nights with a fevered child, empty evenings waiting behind the clinic's door, letters I wrote and never sent, because I didn't know who would read them. And then Ethan's return, not with an apology, but with action. With the first hug he gave his daughter, with the way he listened, with eyes that no longer looked away. Maybe if he hadn't left, we wouldn't have lost so much. But maybe that loss was what it took for both of us to understand the true weight of coming back, not as an escape, but as a commitment. A quiet promise to begin again, not from the beginning, but from where it all fell apart. I looked at him again. In the hush of night, his face was clearer than ever. Tired, yes. Haunted by some regret, yes. But more than anything, there was truth there. A kind of truth that made me believe maybe it's not too late after all. We had lost each other once in a world too wide and uncertain. But somehow, we had found our way back, not to relive what we had, but to continue, stronger, more grateful, and more willing to hold on than ever before. And maybe that, more than anything, is what truly matters. The next morning, as the first light of day slipped through the curtains, I woke in Ethan's arms. His breathing was steady and warm against my ear, and in that quiet moment, I knew some things, though once broken, can find their way back to wholeness in the gentlest of ways. I turned carefully, pressed a kiss to his forehead, and slipped out of bed, moving slowly as though not to disturb the past that was still resting between us. Downstairs, Sophie was already awake. She sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a drawing she'd brought home from school the night before, a family portrait. 3 people, a yellow house, a dog, and above it, in green crayon, the uneven letters read, "My family." I sat beside her, brushed her hair back with my fingers, and asked why she'd colored the house yellow. "Because our house always has sunshine," she said. I smiled, realizing that she was growing up in a reality I once didn't dare to hope for. Ethan came down not long after, still a little tousled from sleep, holding the old camera Marcus had given him. He said he wanted to capture everything, not to post anywhere, not for anyone else, but so that one day, Sophie could look back and know her childhood wasn't a string of unanswered questions. He took a photo of Sophie and me laughing together, of Tom mowing the lawn out back, of Max yawning in a patch of sun. There was nothing extraordinary in these pictures, but every time he clicked the shutter, I saw it the way he looked at us, as though each frame was his quiet thank you for being allowed to return. That afternoon, while Sophie napped, Ethan and I sat by the window where the golden light slanted through the changing trees. He placed his hand on mine, his gaze drifting out into the distance. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. I asked him, "What kind of future?" He answered, "The kind where Sophie doesn't have to be afraid of losing anyone. A future that's safe enough for her to dream big, to believe in what's right, without our shadows clouding her sky." I didn't speak right away. His words stirred something in me, something deep and almost too tender to touch. He continued, "I know I can't undo what's already happened, but I want to live in a way that, one day, our daughter can look back and be proud, not because I was perfect, but because I tried, because I changed, because I loved." I squeezed his hand, holding it tightly. "Ethan, she already is proud. Every time she looks at you, her eyes light up. She doesn't need perfect, she needs present. She needs love that stays, and you're giving her that." Ethan turned to me, his eyes glistening. "I lost so many years, but if I had to do it all over again to get to this moment, I would." I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beside mine, like a promise that needed no words. That night, we spread a blanket across the backyard, lying back to watch the stars. Sophie curled up between us, one small hand in mine, the other in Ethan's. She whispered, "When I grow up, can I tell my friends that my parents went through a lot but still ended up together?" I smiled. "Not only can you tell them, you should, because that's a story about courage, about trust, about a love that wasn't perfect, but never gave up." Ethan nodded, his voice low and full of certainty. "Our daughter will be proud." And when the night deepened, when only the chirping of crickets and the hush of wind through distant trees remained, I realized we no longer needed to know what the future held. As long as we woke to find each other still here, with hands to hold and hearts willing to forgive and continue, then the past was no longer something to mourn. Because from this day on, our future didn't begin with a question. It began with a quiet, certain promise that no matter what may come, we would go forward together. Because our daughter is watching, and she deserves to grow up believing that real love can heal anything. That morning, Ethan rose before I did. When I stepped out of the bedroom, he was already in the small study near the back porch, the place where he often wrote in his journal at night. On the desk lay a large envelope, beside it the old wooden box whose edges had faded with time. I entered the room, about to ask something, but he turned toward me with a strangely calm look in his eyes. He said he was going on a short trip today. Not far, not long, but necessary. I stood still for a moment, then I understood. Ethan didn't spell it out, but I knew this journey was his way of closing a chapter in his life, a chapter that had defined him for far too long, a chapter called the past. That afternoon, Ethan drove alone to the southern outskirts of town, back to the place where he had once lived during his years in the shadows. It was where he'd built a life away from the light, where everything had started to unravel, and where he had once felt the most lost. He stopped in front of an abandoned house with rusted tin roofing, shattered windows, and grass that had overtaken the walkway. He stood quietly for a long while, then opened the trunk and retrieved the wooden box and envelope I'd seen earlier that morning. Inside were old photographs, letters never sent, and a small pistol wrapped in worn leather. Ethan stepped into the house, the one he had once used as a hideout. The walls were still stained, the air thick with mildew, but instead of fear or regret, he felt something close to release rising inside him. He placed the box on a dusty wooden table, opened the lid, and looked over each item as if seeing a version of himself from years ago. Then he took the gun, removed the bullets, and sealed them inside the envelope, writing on it in his own hand, "No way back." At last, he opened his notebook, turned to the final page, and wrote, "Today, I am no longer a man of shadows. I am not running, not denying, and no longer afraid of the light. I am simply a man choosing to stay with his family, and I will never leave again." He closed the notebook, placed it in the box, then struck a match and set it all aflame. The fire rose, catching quickly on paper and memory, burning through the things he had clung to for too long. This time, he let go. Without hesitation, without sorrow. When the flames died down, he stepped outside. The breeze tugged at his jacket, but inside, he felt lighter than he had in years. He drove back in silence. As the car turned down the dirt road leading to the house, the afternoon sun cast golden threads through the trees, stitching light onto the ground like a path home. Sophie was running around the yard with Max, and I stood on the porch holding 2 cups of hot cocoa, just like we always did on chilly afternoons. Ethan pulled in, stepped out of the car with nothing but a quiet smile. I didn't ask how the trip went. He didn't say what he had burned, but when he pulled me into his arms and held me close, I knew the only thing he'd chosen to keep was the present. That night, as we sat together in the warm glow of the kitchen, Ethan told Sophie a story. It was about a man who had once lost his way, but who found it again through the light of two extraordinary girls. Sophie asked eagerly, "Then what happened, Daddy?" Ethan smiled and said, "Then he decided he'd never leave again, because now he knew exactly where he belonged." Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "I don't want you to go anywhere either, Daddy." I watched them, my heart still and full like the surface of a quiet lake. Later that night, just before sleep, Ethan turned to me. His voice was low, steady. "It's done, Claire. The past. Truly this time. There's nothing left to run from. No debts left to pay. Just you, our daughter, and a future I'll protect with everything I've got." I nodded, wrapping my fingers around his beneath the blanket. Darkness doesn't disappear overnight, but when someone is brave enough to turn toward the light, even the smallest step forward can illuminate the path. And I knew, from this moment on, Ethan was no longer a man lost. He was my husband, the father of our daughter, and the man who had the courage to say goodbye to the person he used to be. The sunset settled gently behind the trees, their leaves painted in the final brilliant hues of autumn. The last golden light of the day stretched across the wooden steps where Ethan and I sat, quietly watching Sophie play with Max on the lawn. Everything was so peaceful, so simple, that I almost forgot there had once been a time when our lives were filled with fear, uncertainty, and distance. And yet, it was through those shadowed days, through every small decision, every brave act that we arrived here. Not in a perfect place, but a real one. A family, pieced together from fragments, yet stronger than anything I had ever known. Life does not always offer us the chance to start over, but it does offer us the chance to keep going, if we are brave enough to face the truth, kind enough to forgive, and patient enough to love. The story of Claire, Ethan, and Sophie is not simply about a father returning after years of absence. It is a story of healing, a story of hope, and a story that gently reminds us that every one of us is worthy of a second chance. If you have ever known loss, if you have ever felt lost yourself, or if you have ever wondered whether starting over is even possible, I hope this journey has given you a little light to carry. Sometimes, what we need is not to erase the past, but to learn how to walk forward with what we still have left. And perhaps that is what gives a life its truest meaning. Now, after hearing this story, how do you feel? Did something within you stir? Did someone come to mind? Or have you ever asked yourself, if I had done things differently, would everything be different? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly hope to hear your voice, because every story is its own world, and each shared reflection holds the power to soften the burdens we sometimes believe we carry alone. If this story touched you, and if you would like to hear more journeys filled with feeling, reflection, and quiet strength, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video from the Dear Single Mom channel. And if someone you love might need a gentle reminder that they are not alone, share this video with them. It might just be what their heart needed to hear. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way through. I wish you and your loved ones good health, peaceful days, a calm heart, and a soul warm enough to keep on loving. Until we meet again in the next video from Dear Single Mom, where every story is a quiet touch to the heart, farewell, and may your life be filled with gentle peace.